Hello, well, this is Dr. Dave Maslach talking about reciprocity.com. The E is spelled with a 3. I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I'm creating this platform, this sharing economy proofreading platform, because I truly believe that everybody should be able to get the feedback that they desire to become very, very prolific. So in this particular video, I really want to talk about what are the pros and cons of fake news. What's the impact of fake news on society? There's lots of discussion about fake news at this moment. I'm going to go into both, why is it sometimes, definitely there are a lot of cons and a lot of sort of downfalls and consequences, negative consequences of fake news, but then there's also could be some benefit of fake news, or the sheer volume of fake news that currently exists might actually have some benefits. I'm going to leave that towards the end. Again, these are just my own personal thoughts. It's sort of based loosely on theory and sort of thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time. I don't know of any particular paper at this moment that is strictly focused on thinking about fake news, but I thought this would be interesting to talk about. So what exactly is fake news? From my perspective, fake news is it is something that lacks, it is information that lacks any particular merit, or it misrepresents reality in some sort of way, and it's becoming really big and much more prolific than it normally was in the past. And normally what it was represented was in terms of rumors, for example, might be passed along through sort of personal networks. But now, because of social networks or social media, as well as the ability to do advertising very quickly and cheaply and create a website very quickly and cheaply, what people are doing now with fake news is they're creating a very simple website, for example, and then they are paying for some advertising. Maybe they spend a couple $100s to get some advertising on Facebook or on Google. Some of these platforms are a little bit more stricter than others in terms of being able to do that, but they're paying for advertising to direct traffic, and traffic is people at these particular sites. And normally it was really difficult to actually get anybody to pay attention to these sort of fake news sites now, but with the way that you can actually pay for ads, it's really cheap and quite effective if you want to sort of spread. Basically, it's kind of like propaganda, right? So you're spreading misinformation to other people, and the way that they do that is to make sort of the websites to look kind of legitimate. It's really, really easy to spot this kind of stuff. I had something that was marketed to me about 3 weeks ago about climate change. I have no idea why I was targeted. So by the way, you're targeted when they are picking these ads. They're looking for a specific profile. You can do this very easily and very effectively in Facebook or in Google. You can target specific people when you're presenting ads, and then you present them that particular ad, and then you can go onto that website. Why? It was all about climate change, and it was totally misrepresentation of climate change and how it's actually sort of playing out, and it was clearly was not well done in any sort of way. And they created this sort of they created this website to sort of misrepresent things based on the sort of science of climate change, and they were trying to persuade the sort of propaganda that there is, that the likelihood of climate change was not occurring, which from what I understand, and I'm by no means a climate scientist by any means, I'm a chemical engineer, but that they're sort of persuading people that there is no possibility of climate change. And from what I understand, the sort of science is weighting towards one side than the other. But anyways, the fake news is sort of arriving. It's sort of coming out in many different ways in terms of spreading rumors about different political candidates and all those kind of things. It's all coming up to the up to the surface, and it was really sort of limited in the past in terms of rumors, right? It was a really sort of small network of people that rumors might spread or propaganda might spread. Maybe it was a flyer that was passed around, but that was really small in terms of the amount of influence that people might have. But now what's happening with fake news is you can target, as I mentioned, you could target specific individuals that might have extra influence on society. So you might target somebody that might, maybe it's somebody that has many different connections or something, or they have an influential role. If you can convince that one particular person or people about that particular issue, then you can persuade a large audience because they're going to start spreading the news to other people, right? Now, why do we actually believe in fake news? It seems kind of strange that we might believe in fake news, or people actually believe in that. Well, it sort of depends on what's your ontological assumptions of the world. And this is kind of a big world idea, basically thinking about, do you believe that the world is sort of real beyond you, or do you believe that we all have these sort of subjective perspectives exactly of what is the world, right? So if you believe the one that we sort of have these subjective perspectives and everybody's sort of doing sort of social constructed thoughts of the world, then fake news kind of makes it a little bit more sense, because then everything has merit. What you should do is that you should give the sort of fake news websites not a lot of merit in terms of your perception of what it is, because it's not considered sort of legitimate in the grand scheme of all the different news sources, for example. But then if you have much more of there's an actual legitimate physical world beyond you, I know that kind of seems strange, but that is a real debate that goes on, that there's a real physical world beyond you, then you probably should also be discounting those particular news sources, but you're going to be discounting them more so because you're looking for the credibility of how it actually represents the actual reality beyond us, right? So if it doesn't actually represent reality, or there's definitely a lot more skew in one way, then you can discount that a lot more. So if you have one view that the world is very subjective and you're sort of making things up and it's socially constructed as you go, then you can probably sort of see how fake news might have a little bit more influence in that sort of perspective. But the question is, why do we still actually believe in fake news when it does happen? Well, the first one, there's a lot of kind of good reasons behind this, sort of from a theoretical sense. So the first one is in terms of the diffusion of particular news sources or particular of information or of any sort of innovations that happen. That we tend to believe our neighbors very, very much so, right? So we are very, very trusting of our neighbors. We actually ask our neighbors. This is the way that sort of contagion happens. We just simply ask our neighbors what their perspective is on something, and then we sort of follow or purchase that particular perspective, right? So when this happens all the time in terms of purchasing of goods, right? This was demonstrated by Coleman in the 50s with physicians, that they would adopt different pharmaceuticals based on how, what their doctor friends were saying, or influential doctor friends were saying. So they'd be more likely to adopt particular medications because of that. And that's just kind of normal human nature. And the other thing is that we base our opinions, we base our decisions, a lot of our decisions based on heuristics, because there's only a limited amount of information that you can actually take in. If you were to actually rationally calculate everything that you're doing and make very rational calculations in every single decision, then you're not going to make a lot of decisions throughout your life. And so what we end up doing is doing a lot of heuristics. And one heuristic that we do is we just listen to what other people have done or what they're doing, and then we just kind of copy what they're doing or believe what they're doing. So the question is, if it's really kind of, we shouldn't sort of be believing fake news, but we end up doing it anyways because of these heuristics that we have. What are the consequences of fake news? Well, we kind of know some of the sort of negative consequences and the negative effects on society of fake news. So for example, number one, you might have misinformed actions of a particular, whatever you're doing, you're making some sort of decision. Well, fake news pops up. You're on social media, some fake news pops up, and then persuades you to pursue another particular action. The first one might be sort of political action, right? The way that you are voting, for example, it's really easy for you to be swayed at the last minute because of some sort of fake news or inaccurate information. And that's kind of problematic. It definitely is problematic because there's a lot of decisions that are built on top of sort of that voting, for example, or you make major decisions about maybe major purchasing decisions based on a car, or you're looking at actually getting a car, but then you find out that climate change is maybe not a real thing, so then you end up buying a larger car, for example. A second thing that is really important that people kind of forget about is that you start mistrusting media outlets a lot more. It's kind of like this saying, right? So the fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? So eventually, once you start getting enough fake news, people start discounting news media, and that's why it's really, really important for legitimate news sources to really, really rally against that and try to tackle this issue as much as they possibly can. The third thing that might end up happening is that there is a sort of third negative thing, negative consequence of fake news, is that people might their decisions might be a lot more self-focused, and they might actually use their own experiences rather than sort of pay attention to what other people are telling them a lot more as their particular guideline of their decisions, right? So the problem is with this, and it's been repeated over and over and over again, is that experience is a really poor teacher. That's why we have science, for example, is that a lot of the stuff that we use from our own experience, we've found out through sort of scientific clinical trials or something like that, is that experiences truly is a poor teacher. We have to gather aggregate data, and we have to do that in a very sophisticated and sort of procedural way in order to understand what truly is going on behind the scenes, and that's really difficult to do. Now, here's the question that I think is really kind of interesting, is what are the actual benefits of fake news? Because every particular thing, every particular action that is in the world has pros and cons, right? They have both things that are sort of negatives or negative consequences for society, but then there's some positive consequences at the same time. Everything has that, and there's what's called unintended consequences of these particular things that happen. So because fake news is a really big thing at this moment, then there's probably other sort of consequences that might actually come from that. The first one that a lot of people might forget about is that fake news might actually create more innovation in a society, right? Because what fake news, first of all, it is creating much more, people have heterogeneous opinions, and they're presenting these in different ways, in very simple, easy ways. The other thing that might actually happen is that because we begin to mistrust a lot of the news sources we get, our actions as a whole are going to become less coordinated. That's depending on whether we actually start mistrusting this fake news at all. I myself, I'm not on Facebook a lot anymore because of all of these particular allegations, and it does happen maybe, but still, if Facebook continues to grow, it continues to get much more bigger, and a lot of these social media and sort of social platforms are getting bigger and bigger. So maybe that's not necessarily a big thing that's going to happen, but definitely there is some sort of innovation that happens because of these particular, fake news sources. So, for example, maybe somebody actually has something to say about maybe it's something to say about animal health care or animal welfare or something like that, and they present some sort of fake news. Well, then there's going to be a strong reaction to that, both positive and negative. Well, one of them is being, positive, that they're going to be supportive of maybe that there's some animal propaganda thing going on. and they're going to be very supportive of it. But then there's going to be a lot of people that are going to have negative reactions, and then they're going to be spurred from that sort of motivation to actually go out and do something about it, which actually might have a positive impact sort of in terms of generating more innovation in society. The second thing that I think is probably more important, and it's going to be a lot more, it's going to have a much larger impact, is that there's going to be tremendous institutional pressure at this moment. So all the different institutions around us, from the law, from education, from, maybe it is the news outlets themselves, there's going to be tremendous amount of focus, tremendous amount of pressure to provide better news in general, to crowd out all of this fake news, because we know that there's so much of this sort of illegitimate news that's happening, is that there's going to be much more pressure to provide better news by the legitimate news sources, so they can actually combat some of this misinformation that's out there, or incorrect fake news that's out there, right? So there's going to be probably an emphasis, there's going to be a bifurcation of that. There's going to be a small group that's providing this fake news, this misinformation, but then there's going to be much more pressure by the legitimate sources to provide better quality news sources and information. Now, we've seen this actually in media itself, in terms of the more innovation that's happening in terms of Netflix, for example, or Amazon. There was the large content producers before, in terms of ABC and NBC, that provided kind of, okay sort of media in terms of content, in terms of what we are consuming. But then when there was more pressure, more institutional pressure by kind of from these more illegitimate sources, then it started to bring up the game of having much, much better stories, for example, that people are telling on, or that these channels are telling, as well as much more competition in terms of, where is the selection. We have so much selection now in terms of and the amount of content out there, in terms of what you're paying attention to, and the overall quality is greatly increased from even 10 years ago of the content that's being produced. So that is a real big positive impact of fake news, is that there's going to be this institutional pressure for people to demand better quality news, for example. And the sort of third thing that overlaps with that is that there is going to be institutional pressure by consumers, that are going to demand better news in general. There's going to be a lot more social movements, and we're starting to see those. I've seen them in the past year in terms of demanding better scientific efforts, for example. There was a March for Science in the springtime that was emphasizing, when they were emphasizing just sheer focus on providing science. There's going to be a lot more institutional pressure from people that are really pushing from sort of the consumer side, in terms of creating social movements, in terms of creating better influence or more influence, just better overall quality of content that people can consume, in terms of whether it's actually legitimate or whether it's not, right? So there's going to be a real pushback, not from governments, for example, or from the news sources, but by consumers themselves. They're going to start demanding better news sources, and they're going to start getting really smart. People are really, really incredibly smart, and they can see through a lot of this stuff. Now, a lot of people might not see through some of this stuff, and a big chunk of people might not see some of it and start believing it. But at the same time, there's going to be a large push towards actually choking some of that stuff out. So that's what you should really be concerned about. So those are the pros and cons from my perspective. And I know, this is by no means, this is my own personal opinion and all that kind of stuff. But I think that there are, and we shouldn't discount the effects, the negative effects of fake news, but there are some small sort of, and actually maybe in the long run, very beneficial effects of actually having the presence of fake news, because it creates this tremendous amount of pressure to demand better quality news in the long run. And we've seen this throughout history over years and years, whenever there's some rumors that spread, that people start saying, nah, we got to actually create some sort of institution to make sure that we can actually up our game, right? So, for example, a legal institution, right? So the way that we used to make any particular judgments and decide how somebody actually would have, if they did a crime, we would have just had a little community get together and we would determine whether that person committed a crime, or we just shoot them. But now we've sort of had to up our game, because we know that there's many cases where that was very, very ineffective. So this is going to allow us, in the same way, fake news is going to allow us to up our game in terms of creating better, bigger, and better content and more legitimate content in the long run. So you should just, it's going to be a grind in the short term. There's going to be a lot of not so good things, but in the long term, it's going to really up our game. It's going to up the game of the social media platforms. For example, Facebook, they're going to start really focusing on that. And one that's actually doing very good job is Google. They're starting particularly, or Alphabet, particularly on YouTube. I've started to see that they are really focusing on doing content curation and cleaning up all of the clutter that's out there and making sure that they're getting rid of just sheer propaganda and stuff like that. So it's really wonderful to start seeing this stuff. I'm so happy that this is actually happening. And we're going to see this more and more and more. This has happened throughout the sort of IT world repeatedly in terms of chat rooms. I was thinking about that this morning, in that there was that sort of anonymous chat rooms that were kind of really sketchy 10, 15 years ago, but now we're really open with who we are and what we're about, and we can actually start being, much more, and we're weeding out sort of this anonymous sort of sketchiness stuff that's happening on the internet, and we're making it more visible, more legitimate, and making it a much more better place, and the quality has greatly increased since those chat room days. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully you like this video. I appreciate it. You can watch the other ones, or you could do the old thumbs up. All right, take care. Bye.